Okay, so it looks like we're live on Facebook. I'll get this started. Thanks everyone for coming. This is Book Sandwiched In. I'm Rory Martirana. I am a reference and adult services librarian at the New Haven Free Public Library, directly across from the New Haven Green. And I'm joined today by Jessica Dore, who's just written her new book, Tarot for Change. And Jessica is a social worker and also very well known on social media for her account where she pulls a card a day. Jessica, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Rory, and for everyone who's watching, for being here.
So we're excited to jump into it. If you're on Facebook and you have a question for Jessica, just drop a comment into Facebook and we'll try to get that answered for you on here. And if you're in Zoom, you can do that in the comments section or in the Q&A. If you would prefer to ask anonymously, the Q&A has an option for that. So Jessica, you said that you had a little bit of a reading that you were going to start with.
Yeah, I thought I would do, actually, I wondered whether reading the conclusion in the book would be okay, since I mean it isn't really, there's no spoiler. It's not really like a storybook, although there are plenty of stories in it. So I think I'll do that because I think it'll kind of give a sense of what the book is about and how I understand tarot, and a little of the, I don't know, like the feeling of the book for those who maybe haven't had a chance to take a look at it yet or are curious. Okay, so, and this is my book, Tarot for Change. All right. When I was a kid, my mother, who is also a social worker and storyteller, and who's also here, tuned in today, had a set of Rider-Waite-Smith tarot cards, and I remember how strange they seemed. When I got my own cards many years later, I was inexplicably drawn back to that strangeness, like I was being summoned into a weird world unlike the one I'd grown accustomed to, one that was rational, logical, and a bit dry, if I'm honest. Most of the books I'd read about the human experience up until that time had a sterility about them that felt stripped of what might be nutritive for some invisible, mysterious domain of my experience. And while I am indebted to those books for many things, emotional, behavioral, cognitive, there was a part of me they could never quite touch. That part was unable to absorb the cold metallic language of the manuals and self-help workbooks I'd been immersed in at my day job in psychology publishing. Tarot did something different. Its visual metaphors sent ripples into an undercurrent that I'd always sensed was there but didn't know how to access. And as that layer of my being began to stir, I found myself drawn into a wider ebb and flow of something mythic. Something that locked me into a knowing that life, mine, the lives of the people around me, the inhabitants of Earth and the cosmos at large, was ripe with hidden meaning. I think that's what religious experience is, non-rational experiences of something sacred. Theologian Rudolf Otto developed the concept of the numinous, which professor of religion Stuart Sarbacker has described as the experience of a mysterious terror and awe and majesty in the presence of that which is entirely other and thus incapable of being expressed directly through human language and other media. It was something that, to be understood, had to be experienced directly. I don't know how to talk about what that is exactly. Truthfully, defining it is not an endeavor I have much interest in. But if we could learn to understand change, not intellectually, but in a felt way, as a law of life, keeping one foot on the ground and one in the mysteries, I think we'd be doing pretty well. And I think tarot is just one of many ways we can start to do that, which is why I wanted to call this book Tarot for Change. Many of the secrets shared in my reflections on the 78 Arcana incorporate ideas from therapies specifically designed to support people in making real change in their lives, through building awareness about the complex interaction of different domains of the human experience, the energetic, emotional, behavioral, and intellectual. But this is also a book about orienting ourselves toward the state of things, which is flux, the natural ambiguity of life. It is a book about It is a book of charms that I hope might help you not only cope with and learn from this inescapable natural reality, but even to embrace it on a good day. And it's a book of old wisdom that must itself change in a modern context to meet the times, even as the core of these ideas remains faithful to the ancients. We've tracked the ways that ideas from as far back as ancient Egypt and Greece have cropped up in contemporary evidence-based psychotherapies and are being tapped today for their healing magic, though it likely won't be called that at a behavioral psychology conference anytime soon. There are so many ways to boil down what's most beautiful about tarot. I could say 100 different things easily. I'll share just one here. If you choose to develop your own practice with these strange little cards, you'll get to know yourself better. You'll better understand what it means to be born into a human body with the capacities to experience energy, feel, act, and think. But something else will also happen, and it's a really important something else. Tarot will help you recall yourself in a broader human context. It will do so in a way that reading a self-help book or even filling out pages in a workbook might not be able to do for you. Every card you pull will be like glimpsing a carving on an old rock or tree that reads, "Someone was here." The subtext being, you're not alone in your suffering and your troubles are not new. These things have been experienced, understood, transmuted, and even philosophized about since time immemorial. Illness, heartbreak, deprivation, isolation, death, tragedy, tales as old as time. Remembering this is a medicine. Tarot for Change is an offering that came from years of a committed relationship with the cards themselves, and it is what became possible through that work, among other things. A heightened capacity for being in uncertainty, an understanding that doing my best and needing to do better are not mutually exclusive, and a willingness to display not only the parts of myself that I'm most proud of, but also the holes in my thinking, the places where my understanding lacks discernment or grace or wisdom, the vulnerabilities. And I hope that the reflections shared here, taken with the understanding that they've derived directly from my personal journey with tarot and life and the secrets the cards have told me, will support you in your own journey of finding what's possible, what you're here to do, and how to hold it all lightly, knowing it won't stay. Thank you.
I'm like muting myself. That's a good context for us to get started. A little bit of background on the book. About yourself, I know you wrote a great deal in the book about what brought you to social work. Do you want to go over that a little bit for folks who maybe haven't read it yet or don't know a lot about your background, and then maybe talk a bit also about what brought you to tarot?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, I've had a really kind of sideways, strange journey in like the world of psychology and also tarot. I think more so psychology. I studied communications in college and was a writer, a poet. Creative writing was my thing. And I realized after college, I went to college in New Orleans, that I wanted to work in book publishing because I love books. And so I didn't want to move to New York, so I moved to the Bay Area because I knew there were some publishers out there. And I, sort of as fate would have it, I ended up getting a job at New Harbinger, which is a self-help and psychology book publisher. And when I started, I remember on my first day, they sort of told me, like the head of the marketing department and my boss, who I was a publicist, I was hired to be a publicist there. I was sort of told like, okay, you're going to be responsible for marketing and doing publicity for they call them the professional books. So they're like books for therapists about how to do different treatments, different interventions, different kinds of therapy for different psychological, DSM disorders and psychological problems that people have, anxiety, depression, OCD, PTSD, all kinds of things. And so I worked there for 6 years and just like was really kind of in depth, like kind of combing through these books, these manuals, like just kind of like learning the language, interacting a lot with the authors and who were clinicians and researchers, going to conferences. I just like, and I was, like I said, I started there as like a poet, as a person who liked doing creative writing. But I got really into the material, and when I left there 6 years later, I decided I wanted to go to graduate school and become a therapist, because I wanted to engage with the ideas in a more practical way. And I got into tarot while I was at New Harbinger, like in the early years at Harbinger. I was reintroduced to tarot by a couple of friends who I worked with at New Harbinger who were into it. And I got my own deck, and just the rest was history. I started interpreting the cards through this kind of psychological lens with a lot of the ideas that I was learning about in my day job. And then I left there. I did go to social work school, trained as a therapist, and that graduated in 2019, and then started writing my book. And that was like a 2-year project. So here we are today.
So for people watching who maybe aren't as familiar with tarot, I know something that friends of mine find a little like odd or unusual or even like off-putting is the personification when you're talking about your deck and your cards. Like even in the book, you talk about how the tarot cards tell secrets. We talk about living with the cards, developing a relationship with the cards. How would you explain this to someone who's maybe new to tarot or unfamiliar with it, or even like a little skeptical and uncomfortable with it? Like I know, like it freaked out my dad when we were talking about this a little bit when I was younger, when I was in like high school and stuff. I wanted to get into this stuff, and they were super religious and a little nervous about it. So like, how would you describe that to just like the average person on the street if they were to ask you what that was all about?
Yeah, I mean, that's really like interesting, I think, and useful feedback for me to hear. Just because for me, I'm so excited by the idea of like kind of personifying image a little bit. And also like I can see how that would, like, someone who is already feeling skeptical or nervous about tarot would kind of be like, what do you mean, like the cards are entities? Like that's very strange language to be using, and off-putting to use the word that you used. I would probably walk that language back to someone who I could tell was sort of already a bit like skeptical or uncomfortable about tarot, and kind of just break it down to, this is a set of images, and you can shuffle the deck and pull an image and take a look at it, and just kind of like see what comes up for you. It doesn't have to, you don't have to see it as having a personified energy. You don't have to see it as like having a life of its own. You don't have to like see any of those things. I think it can be really helpful if you are comfortable to go there. But really at the most basic level, it's a set of images that you can look at and work with and make associations with, and then, amplify those associations to use some language that I've learned in like the dream work community around interpreting symbols and archetypes that in a way that can be helpful.
Can we talk a little bit about the deck? So it's a deck of 78 cards. They're split into the 2 arcanas, the major and the minor. And then I don't know if you wanted to maybe like give a little background for people who might not be familiar with it, and how there are meanings attached to each minor suit.
Yeah, totally. So I have my deck here. There's 78 cards in this deck, and in many classic decks that are based on this deck or based on other similar like adjacent decks. And as Rory mentioned, the deck is divided into 2 main categories, the major arcana and the minor arcana. And if you don't know anything about tarot, you might be saying, what does arcana mean? I actually learned that arcana is the correct pronunciation when I was reading the audiobook, but I still say arcana because that's always what I've said.
Always said arcana.
Yeah, I'm like, I don't think I could just change. It's okay for like the pronunciation to change over time. So anyway, that is a little side note, but that word arcana is the plural for arcanum or arcanum, which means secret or mystery. And so you have this set of cards, and each one of these cards is either a major secret or a minor secret, or a major mystery or a minor mystery. And I kind of like to think about the major arcana and the minor arcana as the metaphor that I often use is like imagine you're going on a journey. Like I'm driving, I live outside of Philadelphia. I'm driving from here to New Haven. And so like I have my vehicle that I'm going to drive, and then I have like the road map that's going to like take me there. And so like the minor arcana are kind of like the user's guide to the vehicle. Like, you know, they're going to tell you about the different systems in the vehicle, what you need to do to maintain them and make sure that you don't get into any trouble with them because you didn't pay any attention and they kind of like did their own thing and went off. And then the roadmap is going to help me tell me how to get to New Haven. And so that's the major arcana. It's more like this. I'm kind of botching this metaphor right now, but the idea that like the major arcana are sort of these images to do with, there's 22 of them, and they're images to do with this sort of broader human journey. And then the minor arcana are everything else. And those are images to do with these different domains of the human experience. So thoughts, feelings, energy, and behavior in my interpretation, and kind of what you need to know about each of those different domains in order to make sure that you get to the destination in one piece. And of course, the implication there is that, you know, developing like a degree of competence in the swords, which is like the intellect. So you might like do mindfulness practice, or you do different like exercises to learn how to relate with your mind in a healthy way or a productive way. That is, it's not just like, it's a means to a greater end, which you find in the major arcana, which I think are more to do with like spiritual concerns and kind of what is the purpose of being human, aside from just like our own personal goals. That was a really long, convoluted, I hopefully I didn't turn everybody off.
It was good. It was good. I think that it's important too to note, like, when people hear tarot, they think divination a lot of times, especially people who don't really, you know, have a deck of tarot cards or have never done it before on their own. And it's not necessarily the only purpose. I've never used tarot cards for divination. It's always been like sort of a self-exploration thing for me personally. So that's like one of the reasons I was very excited about your book. So what inspired you, and I kind of talked about this in your background, but what really inspired you to start applying the psychological principles to your readings and your interpretations of the cards?
It just happened naturally, honestly. I can't really pinpoint like that there was a real like, oh, I want to do this thing or I want to like make this contribution. It was more just like when you're going to an office every day and you're reading about these ideas, and then, you know, you're coming home at night and you're pulling tarot cards as part of your daily evening practice. It's hard not to see those ideas in the images. At least for me, it was like, it just felt very natural. I thought, wow, you know, I talked about the sword suit just a moment ago. The swords in tarot have to do with intellect and the mind and kind of like judgment and evaluation and discernment and meaning making. And so when you look at those cards, it's really hard not to see some of the things that you're also learning about, like the pitfalls of having a mind that is constantly judging and evaluating, and what are some of the ways that you learn how to deal with that. And mindfulness, for example, was a big topic at the publisher that I worked at. So I was like, oh, that's really interesting. I'm seeing a lot of these ideas in these images, and metaphor too is like huge in psychotherapy. And so I just recognized that I was looking at a set of images that were visual metaphors, and that metaphor can have a tremendous amount of like therapeutic power, because it kind of brings you out of your sort of like really like maybe a fixed way of looking at something, and gives you like an experience that you weren't expecting.
So I'm sure you have multiple decks of cards, but your Instagram account where you do the card pulls, and the book also, you refer a lot to the classic Rider-Waite or what Rider-Waite-Smith deck of cards.
Mm-hmm.
Is there something in particular about that artwork that spoke to you? Like, I've always had kind of trouble. I have one of those decks, and I've always had trouble kind of connecting with that art. But I brought I have my favorite deck here, and it's like, oh, there's my Queen of Swords. So it's like a Celtic
Nice. Oh, that's awesome.
deck. And like, this is the artwork that I connected with the most. So this is like the beaten up deck that is like worked in that I spend the most time with. So I was just curious about with you, like, was it the artwork that spoke to you, or is it just like that's what you were most comfortable with?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it was a combination, and like I'm sure it's valuable for people to hear your experience of sort of like, yeah, that deck, like I have one and it's it's popular and stuff, but here's the one that I really connected with, and that's like to me that's like the most important thing, that you, if you're interested in having a tarot practice, that you have a deck of cards with the art that you really connect with. And yeah, for me, like first of all, I didn't know a lot of other deck. Like I didn't know about a lot of other decks when I got this deck. And so I just sort of like didn't really know what else was out there. And I knew of this deck because, as I mentioned, my mom had this deck when I was a kid, still does. And so like I remembered the art and the images, even though like really only peripherally, because we didn't like engage in that way much. Like I knew she had them and that kind of thing. But yeah, I think it was just like, it was comfortable for me, and I've just like consistently found a lot of, I like find new things all the time in her art, in Pamela Coleman-Smith's art, that just like blow my mind, and that's really like reinforcing for me and just like keeps me interested.
Do you have a favorite card, like or a card that you really especially connect with?
I don't. I feel like they change. They really, and I talk about this in the book, like the cards shapeshift in context, and so it really depends for me. Like there might be a card that might be my favorite card to get on a particular day, or to see, or that I'm really interested or really working with. Like the writing that I've been doing this year, like kind of since completing the book, has been trying to trace and like track the characters from the tarot, particularly the major arcana, in like mythologies and old stories. And in that process, I've developed like just deepened relationships with like the Tower, for example. I did this series writing about the Cupid and Psyche myth over the summer. And in that story, there's a tower that is really like benevolent. It saves the protagonist. She has to take an underworld journey, and the tower like gives her all this instruction about what to do and exactly like how to get through. And in the tarot, the Tower card is like this really scary card that nobody likes getting, because it's like a distraction and everything's falling apart. And that was really helpful for me to see the Tower in a different context, in a different form. And in that moment, I would probably say, oh, the Tower was my favorite card then, but now I'm onto something else. So yeah, it's hard to choose favorites. They're always showing up in weird ways.
The Tower always freaks me out. Like I know you've talked about how it cannot necessarily be negative, but like it's like one of those that always makes me nervous.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I mean, I see such varied reactions with the Tower. Like some people, it's always interesting, and this is what's so interesting about tarot, is like some people like will get it and be like, oh, thank God, like what a relief to like see that there, because it just supports that like I'm getting to let go of like something that's not working anymore. And then for others, like depending on the state that you're in, I'd be like, oh God, like I don't know if I'm ready, like, and that's It's scary. Totally. I've definitely pulled the Tower and not been happy about it.
So you refer to Tarot for Change as more of a self-help book than, say, a how-to manual. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and maybe explain to folks what your rationale behind that is. It's pretty apparent after reading the book, but I don't know if everyone's finished reading it yet.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you've looked at the book or if you haven't looked at the book, there's 3 sections. The first section is just kind of like an introduction, kind of setting the stage, introducing myself, talking a little bit about one version of like kind of a history of tarot and psychology. There's many ways of telling history. It's one perspective. How the two kind of are related, what's my story, that's in section 1. Section 2 is pieces of writing that I did about each of the 78 cards. And then section 3, along with images from Javier Lopez, who illustrated the book, illustrated the deck for the book, which is incredible. And then the third section is sort of the how-to section. And I say in that section that I kind of reluctantly did it because my editor and the publisher, they were like, you got to include a how-to in here, like for people who want to know. And I'm like, oh, okay. So I did, but it's really like the writing. I would say that the second section, the reflections on the cards, that's really to me the meat of the book. It takes up the most in terms of real estate inside the pages. And that is really like, they're reflections on the cards, but really they're using the cards as to illustrate concepts. So it's less about Four of Pentacles means this and more about here's this idea that you can kind of see when you look at this image. And here are some concepts and skills that might be supportive for you if this feels relevant to your life. Like I could give an example if that would be helpful. I don't know if I should. Okay, like, so for example, I wrote in the book about Queen of Pentacles, and how, you know, the pentacles are sort of traditionally associated with career and finance, and that these are like, you know, the pentacle is a coin, and you can see the coin there in the image. And that in my interpretation of the Pentacles suit, associated with behavior, because behavior is the domain of our human experience that is most closely connected to Earth, which is what the Pentacles are related to, the Earth element in a 4-element system. Hopefully that's not too like eyes glazing over. But I associate the Pentacles with behavior, and the Pentacles are traditionally associated with like money and that sort of thing. And so I talked in this card about how the concept of values, which is something that's used a lot in therapeutic work or counseling, or just any kind of like work where you're trying to make change in your life, you identify your values and what's important to you. And values are behavioral. They are by definition, like, it's not a value if you aren't enacting that value. That's sort of like a way to think about it, that it's not enough to just say, this is what I believe, if you don't sort of also invite in that behavioral component of moving in alignment with that thing. And so that's just one example of like how I kind of bring in a concept and then use the image to illustrate. This isn't maybe the best example because this illustration, like, I didn't really talk too much about the illustration itself, but that just to give a sense, like, here are some ideas that I think are supportive when you're trying to make change in your life. And here's an image that I think pairs really nicely with this concept. And then I'll draw in symbols and visuals from the image to support the idea.
So would you be able to walk through for people who, you know, maybe never seen a tarot reading in action? I know it's kind of different depending who the practitioner is, but like what your process would be like if you were doing a reading for someone?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So when I do readings for people, I do them over Zoom. And so I give a kind of spiel in the beginning that, you know, I'm gonna like pull the cards and then take a picture of them and send it to you so you can look at them and that kind of thing. But generally, like, I begin just kind of by asking people, you know, did you have something in mind that you wanted to explore or focus on? And I try to be really open-ended in like the way that I pose that question. And sometimes I'll have people who will say like, you know, I want to know what my year is going to be like. And I'll say, well, you know, I don't do fortune, like I don't use cards to divine the future. So that's not in my skill set. But what I can do is, you know, pull the cards, and we'll think about the cards as doorways that we're going to sort of walk through together during the conversation, and we'll explore and poke around, and we'll look at what symbols are there, and we'll ask questions about what that brings up for you and how that relates to the context of your question. Occasionally people are put off by that, you know, somebody who really wants to do a more traditional style tarot reading, and I try to give people the opportunity at the outset, if I can tell that that's what they want, to like opt out, you know, and say, you know what, never mind, I don't want to do this, because the process that I do, it's conversational. It's like, it does involve participation, but also like the person kind of needs to be open to explore and to share things. And I know that like, that's something that somebody needs to really want and be willing and consent to doing. So if you come expecting to have your fortune told, you need to have the opportunity to kind of like opt out of anything else other than that. So yeah, I turn the cards over, and then we kind of just like, we might begin with, maybe there will be some major arcana, like I'm kind of just shuffling here. I'll say, oh, Wheel of Fortune, okay. And I'll say, for me, this card has a lot to do with change. And I might say a few other things and then say, you know, what is that? What's coming up for you? Or do you have any sense of why that might be related? And we just go from there. And I mean, I find that using the cards to ask a lot of questions of the person that I'm working with, it's so much more powerful than just me sitting there talking, because they get to kind of do their own interpretation and find their own like wisdom and relationship with image that I think is really powerful.
Awesome. I really liked the idea of a notebook with a page for each card. I think that's such a great way to develop a relationship with the cards and to really get to know the meanings. Like I'm pretty familiar with the major arcana, and I've been doing this since high school, so that's close to 25 years. But I still like certain cards in the minor suits. I'll have to flip through some books before I know for sure what those mean.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think that there's a benefit to doing that for people who have been working on their own tarot decks, or do you think that's like better just for beginners?
Yeah, I mean, I have to shout out, and I do this in the book, my friend Janice Fitch, who told me, when this was one of my friends from Harbinger, who like brought tarot cards over to my house and kind of like brought them back into my life in doing so. And she had a notebook that she made a page for each card, and she would like write, different things. And then she had sort of her own book that she could turn to and use if she was giving someone a reading or giving herself a reading. And I definitely think that's a useful practice. And even after maybe you fill up your notebook with, different interpretations that you read on the internet or in books, or different just ideas that you have when you're working with the cards, you could, I remember like after that, I started a second notebook where I was specifically trying to make one that was like, not my own interpretations, but they were like some of the ideas that are in tarot for change. It's like bringing in cognitive behavioral therapy and acceptance and commitment therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, these different therapies and concepts from there that I see in the tarot deck. And I wanted to like write those all down. So I made a second book of kind of the more, okay, they're getting a little more abstract, but still related to kind of those original interpretations or the classic interpretations. So you can like take it as far as you want, and I think it's definitely helpful.
So would you say the notebooks were a big like help to you as you were writing the actual book?
That second notebook that I made, I gave up on like after a little while. I think like I was writing publicly a lot about the cards, like on Instagram and on Twitter and in my newsletter, which I've been doing for 5 years. And so, yeah, like I think I just was like, I had this other outlet where I was writing. I think for me, writing about things really helps me learn and like solidify. Yeah. So yeah, I wasn't doing it there, but I was doing it elsewhere, and that definitely was helping me like crystallize and just like work through. I mean, that's a great thing about publishing on the internet. It's a great thing, and also like there's pitfalls to it too. Like you have all this room to explore and to share things, but you also you have to think about what it means to be responsible as a person who's writing about ideas that where a lot of people are reading them. That's like, especially about psychology and mental health and that kind of stuff. So that's been an interesting journey as well.
So we have a question from the audience asking, and this is so great, how do you feel now that the book is done? And it's just had his 1 week birthday. So
yeah. I feel pretty good. I mean, it's like the year was like hard. And I say the year because I turned in the final draft or like the final manuscript. My editor, Amy Sun, like literally had to cut me off. She was like, you cannot make any more changes. And I was like, no. And then like, that was grueling, like very grueling for me. And then I went through, like, that was in February. And then from February until last week when the book came out, I just went through this whole like, I don't know if it was a grieving process. I don't know what it was. There was definitely a lot of like bargaining. There was a lot of anxiety. There was a lot of like just being really hyper critical, I think, as a way to like cope with the loss of control, I'm sure. Yeah, now I feel pretty at peace with it. Like I feel it feels really good to see people have it. I feel like when I can step back from it, I'm grateful that the book was written because I do think it's different. It does provide a different perspective on tarot, particularly like the interpretations that bring in behavioral therapies and ideas from the psychology field. I think in a way that a lot of the psychologically oriented tarot books are very Jungian and like analytic in their perspective. And my book is more of a behavioral perspective. So it's less about mining the unconscious and more about like the mechanics of behavior change in the present. So I think that's good that it's out there, and I have to let go of all the other the judgments. Like last night, I was really anxious about the book and various things related to the book, but I'm feeling better today.
It's an amazing book. There's
Thank
nothing to be anxious about. Like, you did a great job.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I know you had written in the book that like part of your writing process was during the pandemic. So I have kind of a twofold question for you. One is sort of how the pandemic influenced your writing process, and also in what kind of ways did the process of writing the book maybe influence or change your relationship and understanding of tarot?
Yeah. How the pandemic influenced my writing process. I mean, it was kind of like I already was kind of like, I mean, I had the privilege to be working from home, working on the book, doing tarot readings, like doing the various things that I already was doing remotely. So the particulars of like my writing process didn't change that much because I was already like kind of isolated. Like I wasn't doing a lot of socializing. I was doing a lot of reading and I went to Berkeley and just like, yeah, I don't know. That was a whole like story in itself. But it definitely, I think, impacted me certainly in ways I think that I don't realize yet. I did definitely start to like have a lot of big questions about some of the major like philosophical underpinnings of the ideas that are in the book. You know, like which are, like I said, they're to do with like behavior change, and so they're very individualistic. They're very much about the individual and how the individual how you understand yourself and how you know, find your values and move in alignment with those things. But in a situation like a pandemic, you start to recognize the interrelatedness and the collective dimensions of the human experience in a way that I think I was aware of before, but I just started to turn a lot more toward those things and have questions around psychology and how some of the ideas in the book and elsewhere, the places where those ideas come from, have not really adequately addressed like a more collective psychology. And then how did the book change my relationship to tarot? Or like, I think the experience that I had of having to be cut off from making changes like to the book Tarot for Change, and the whole theme of the book was change, and I was like, this is so weird. I have to write something and it has to be final, and I don't get to change things anymore. That's like the nature of a book. It's just set in stone, so to speak. And it just really made me realize how the cards you can just never get to a place where you're like, okay, yep, this is, to me, this is what this card is about. This is what it means, and that's it forever. It only solidified the sense that I already had that the cards shapeshift in context, including the cultural context, the social and political context that they're in. And I could write this, I said this somewhere else, I don't remember to who, but like I could write this book, the exact same book again now, and it would be like a lot of the interpretations would be very different.
Just looking through my notes a little bit. Can we talk about your social media a little? So I know like that's sort of the root of how the book evolved. What prompted you to start that? 'Cause I know I've been following it for several years, but I'm just curious, is it like an evolution of your notebooks that you were talking about, or what made you decide to share it with the world?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think when I left New Harbinger, I had been like, I was active on Instagram, but like was more so interested and active on Twitter. Like I would share like articles and ideas of, like from the psychology field and things like that. I'd go to conferences and be like tweeting and sharing things that I was learning. And I was kind of just like more over there. And then when I left New Harbinger, I started a blog and a newsletter where I was writing about the tarot cards and kind of pairing them with ideas from the psychology field. And so I started like using Twitter as a way to like promote my blog posts and my newsletter. Like I would, you know, tweet little like quotes from the newsletter and stuff. And yeah, and then like the daily tarot cards on Twitter is kind of that's probably the thing that gets the most reach or has gotten the most reach over the years. I've been doing them for 4 years, and it's a Twitter tarot reading, but it's like it's an idea from the field of psychology or behavioral psychology, ideas about change, ideas about relationships and boundaries and creative life and all kinds of things. And that just happened because I tweeted one day like a card that I had pulled, like, oh, today's card, and I wrote something about it, and then I recognized that people kind of liked it, so I kept doing it, and I've been doing that for 4 years now or so. And then Instagram kind of just, I started doing longer writings about the cards over there and finding also that people were interested, and yeah.
So another audience question, and if anyone else has any questions, feel free to toss them out. And we'll be happy to try to get an answer for you. This one asks, will you be teaching more classes now that your book is released, or is there something else that you are or will be working on?
Yeah, I don't know if I'll be teaching more classes. I think if anything, like writing a book has really instilled in me a much deeper like sense of responsibility around like what it means to like have a platform and to be talking about ideas that are reaching a lot of people. And I think the same goes for my classes. Like when I started to our conversation just a moment ago, it's like you don't have anybody following what you're doing, so you're just like saying stuff, you know, and it's kind of like, okay, you know, but then things grow and you turn around one day and you're like, wait a minute, people are like telling me that they talk about these things with their parents and their partners, and they're, you know, they sit at the breakfast table and say, well, Mary, what did Jessica pull today? And they talk about it. It's like you're impacting people's lives. And so I think like in terms of teaching more classes, like I am doing one class right now on tarot reading. And it's just a kind of I share my approach to reading, which I mentioned earlier. It's like very much focused on asking questions and dialogue. And I feel like that's a good class, and I feel good about the material and my like ability to teach it, but I'm not sure what other classes I might do. It might take a while. I'm really focused right now on my newsletter, which is called Offerings. It's through Substack. And it started, I mentioned, like in 2016, I started a monthly newsletter called Tarot Offerings. And I've been doing it every month since then. And in July, I started doing weekly ones. So there's like a paid weekly version. And that's where I'm just kind of working through ideas. And I'm still working with tarot, of course, and the images from Pamela Coleman Smith. But bringing in ideas from psychology and philosophy and religion, mythology. And I mean, it's kind of like just process, focus, working through things and sharing what I'm reading and that kind of stuff. That's where a lot of my focus has been going. So thanks for putting that link in there.
Yeah.
That. Yeah.
So you were mentioning in the book that you don't read reversals the way a lot of traditional tarot readers would, because they're already implied. So at first when I read that, I was like, kind of thought it was a little strange, but then it seems like very intuitive. Did you always read that way, or like even when you were back in like the 1 card a day filling out your notebook, or did you come to that later on, and what brought you there?
I did always read that way. And I think in the book, I say like something about, I can't remember exactly, but I think I kind of give a little bit of a disclaimer of like, this is like kind of just how I've felt about it intuitively. But if you really want to like think or talk about reversals, like finding someone that does read reversals or like working, like that would be helpful, because I think like there are a lot of people who would, and for those who are here who don't know what reversals means, it means when you pull a tarot card and it's upside down, then that many people say that that has a different meaning than the upright card does. And I honestly just never, I think I was so overwhelmed by the deck when I first started pulling cards that I was like, there's no way I'm going to learn 78 meanings of the upright cards and 78 meanings of the upside down. That's double the work. There's just no way that's going to be possible. So I didn't. And I just never, and I've come up with like various, like that concept that the reversal like is implied in the upright. Like to me, that makes sense, but there are people who would say that's not true because the reversal has a totally different interpretation than the upright one. And I just don't know enough about it to speak on it. So, and yet here I am speaking on it.
It's like funny though, because even with like, I had been reading reversals, but with my deck, it's like barely noticed, especially with like, well, it's coins, not pentacles in mine, but it's like, it's going to be the same.
Yeah.
Either way. So how do you, I don't know. It was kind of cool to me to see that, like maybe that I've been, overdoing it or something. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know either. I think people should, like in your case, it kind of sounds like you're like, it wasn't really like whatever I was doing before, like it wasn't really like making sense anyway. And maybe I was so I think that's maybe the lesson. It's an intuitive creative practice and an interpretive practice. So you can kind of be flexible about how you're doing it. There are books, and definitely there are books, and there are people who will say, this is the rules and this is how you do it. You should always do it this way. And that's okay. But like my approach is a different one.
Have you ever used a significator kind of card when you do readings? Like should we explain that to people? I don't know.
Yeah,
it's sort of like symbolizes yourself. Like for instance, when I pull, especially like traditional spreads, like they're so I have to like back myself up because like I'm assuming because and people are here that read your book, everyone will know.
Right.
Like there are some traditional spreads you could just pull a card at random, but there are things like a Celtic cross spread, or trying to think of the names of some other ones, that are like traditional that have been done over the years. And like, especially for those, I like to use one. But I know not everyone does. So I was just curious because you didn't really mention them.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious, like when for certain spreads you like to use one, like what do you find the value is in? I've just kind of like never really done them. So like, I just like never did. I never like thought about it that much. I like heard it was a thing and was kind of like, oh, okay. For you, what's the value in doing that? Because maybe people who are here might like
personally, well, so the card I use is the Queen of Swords, and that's one that I always really strongly connected with, just from reading about it. And especially so the Celtic cross deck that I mentioned, that's my favorite. That came with the book, and the book kind of applies the cards to different folklore from like the Celts and stuff. So they sort of likened the Queen of Swords to Morgan Le Fay in the King Arthur legends. So but it's it was like, and it's like the typical thing where she's kind of aloof or whatever, and I kind of connected to that. And then when I read your book, I kind of liked your meaning better. But like that's always been something. So when I do it, like I'll lay that down and then I'll kind of apply the interpretations through that lens
Got it.
of that person. So, and then I'll take them, like I did a reading for a friend once. I just like try to apply it to what I know of the person. I think like there are other ways to pick them. Like some people use like astrological signs and stuff. I don't know. I don't
Yeah.
know a lot about that, but it's just like based on what I know about the card and the person, I'll pick a card to like signify that person.
Yeah. There was a class that I used to teach called Tarot Skills, and it was a tarot reading class also. And I would bring in like different ideas that I had kind of heard about through working in, training in therapy and learning about therapy through the years of working with those books and stuff. And there's a kind of therapy called internal family systems that I kind of like was a little bit inspired by in this concept, which was like, the idea is that each of us contains like a diverse internal family. So we have like different parts that have different wants and needs, and sometimes they're all like, working together, and other times they're conflicting. And so that's when by that reasoning, like that's when you find that you're stuck or you're like having problems in your life. And I thought about that a little bit and how that applies to tarot card reading. And sometimes I would think about like, you could pull a spread and you might pick a card in the spread that would represent like, sort of like who you really like. There's all these parts, and then there's sort of like a version of you that's like the true self, so to speak. And maybe that is the Queen of Swords or someone that shows up in there that feels really good. And then you might find like that there are other parts like represented by other cards in the spread. That would be the closest to that you would kind of be like, okay, they're here and they're valid. They have, wants, needs that, are legitimate. And they're not like the ultimate like boss of what I do or don't do. Like there's a scared part, and there's a part that's like really willful, or there's stubborn part, or like whatever it is. And then there's this sort of like Queen of Swords over here who's calling the shots. And so she's taking them seriously, but she's not like allowing them to be in charge. And that's probably the closest to hearing how you're describing the significator. I'm like, oh, that actually is, I guess that's my version of it. But yeah, I haven't done that in a while, like in a reading. I haven't done that in a long time, but I used to talk about it in a class.
We're getting close to the end of the hours. If anyone has any questions for Jessica, please toss them out there for us. I was wondering if you had advice for folks who are new to this and maybe picked up your book and then decided to go out and like grab a deck of cards and start making a journey into that. Do you have advice on how to pick a deck, or like does the deck kind of picks you? I feel like, I don't know.
The advice that I get, like the practical advice that I give for picking a deck is to like go on Instagram, and if you have Instagram, and like look at the tarot hashtag, because you'll see a whole like feed of posts where there's a lot of people posting about tarot, and so you'll see a lot of different art. Like people have all different kinds of cards, and if you scroll through there, you might say, oh wow, that art is beautiful, or that art really, I feel seen by these, or I feel represented by these, or whatever that is. That to me seems like the Instagram tarot hashtag feels like a good sort of place to go, where you'll see like a really diverse range of like some of the tarot cards that are out there. Otherwise, of course, if you know a deck that you want already, then I think you can get the deck and bring it home and pull a card every day at a time that feels good for you. Maybe it's morning, maybe it's night, maybe it's middle of the day, and just one card a day and see what happens. You can, I used to like just Google, I'd pull Queen of Pentacles, Google Queen of Pentacles, meaning, and I would, or I had Rachel Pollack, 78 Degrees of Wisdom, pick a book, my book, whatever books you want to use, and see what comes up.
So we're getting some questions coming in here. Will you be creating your own tarot deck in the future?
I probably will not. Javier, because I'm not an artist, a visual artist at all. Javier Lopez, who illustrated my book, is like, we've been talking about creating a deck from those illustrations, or like she would be creating a deck and maybe I would do a guidebook or something. So that's definitely in conversation, keep an eye out for it. If you like those illustrations, I think they're amazing.
They're beautiful, yeah.
Yeah, she's great. So I think that'd be really cool. That's probably the closest I'll get to creating a deck. I like my Rider-Waite-Smith deck. I'm like, if we do make a deck together, I'll probably still use this one. But yeah.
What is important for you to feel secure when reading for others? Do you have a ritual of some sort before you begin?
I think I feel secure when when I feel like the other person is comfortable. Because I'm comfortable and I'm in my element when I'm reading cards at this point. I've been reading like professionally, I guess you could say, in exchange for money for the last 5 years. And it's not a long time, but it's long enough that I feel like, yeah, I'm pretty comfortable. And so for me, like, I'm very grounded in the way that I do it. Like I described earlier, I explain to people the logistics of how things work. And then I say, okay, I'm going to pull 10 cards and then we're going to talk about them. I use very like sort of straightforward secular language, which for me feels grounding. And I think often is grounding for the person that I'm working with, so that it almost feels like if there's something for them that they want to bring in that is maybe more spiritual, that they're able to do that, but that I'm not kind of like putting any of that on them. I'm not like, I don't know, like everyone is different. And I think, but because I work with people who are all over the world at times, I've worked with people at all different places. And so I think it's been important to like, just, yeah, I never want the person to be uncomfortable if I'm bringing in like, I don't know, my own like spiritual practices or like prayers or anything like that. So yeah, I just kind of keep things very like straightforward, and that makes me feel grounded, and I think it makes other people feel grounded too, but that wouldn't be right for everyone.
Terrific. So we're really, really close to the 1 o'clock mark. So I think I'm gonna call it there. We're getting a lot of thank yous in the Q&A and also in the chat. Everyone's very appreciative for your time. Thank you so much, Jessica, for joining us today. I just have like a little bit of housekeeping to do. So the program today was made possible by gifts to the New Haven Free Public Library Foundation. If you enjoyed this discussion, please consider making a donation at nhfpl.org/donate, which will help support our collections, programs, and services throughout the year. And join us again next Friday. We'll be chatting with Steve Ham about his book, The Pivot, and he will actually be zooming in live from the UN Climate Change Conference in Glasgow. That's been all over the news, so that will be exciting for us. And that's a local author. Thank you so much again, Jessica. This has been really fantastic, and it's so great to be able to talk to you about the book. The book is terrific. We have copies at the library, which, yeah,
thank you.
Well, that's mine, but we do have copies at the library. And if you want your own copy that you can write in like I did, you can pick that up as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rory, for having me, and to the library for doing this, and yeah, everyone for being here. Thank you so much.
Yep. It's been awesome.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.